It's Nerdy, and welcome back to the Transmissions Draft League Season number 4. We are here to recap the 4th week of Season number 4, and this was a great one. With this recap, we now mark the midpoint of the season. We are halfway through the season with only 3 more weeks left to go. So by now we have a pretty good idea of how well all of these teams are performing, as well as what to look for going into the back half of the season. So without further ado, let's go ahead and recap, talk about predictions for week 5, and as well as what our playoff running looks like so far, and then we'll talk about some stats and well-performing Pokemon so far. First game up for the week is of course our match versus the Dream Park Duo Blades. If you have not watched that video already, make sure you go ahead and do that. It's a quick one, but essentially what happened is we had a game plan going into this, and our opponent didn't have anything that actually interacted with our strategy, and so we were able to just run it through. Reuniclus ended up getting 8 KOs in a very quick 2-game set. So like I said, if you have not already, make sure you watch that video, as it has the full breakdown of how we came to the conclusion of that strategy working and how we stuck to it and got it done. Next up, our Dark Division rivals, the Bit Breakers, took on the 10-star team, and the Bit Breakers got it done in 2 as well. This was a tough matchup, I think, for the 10-star team. Of course, Team Lu is really hard to break through if you are the 10-star team, not relying on something like a Zoom roll. That being said, the Bit Breakers did have to actually execute, and I think that they did pretty seamlessly. Ursaluna, Arcanine, and Ting Lu were just enough offense to get through all of Tensor's team pieces, and their best Pokemon, Golden Go, got a grand total of 0 KOs in the matchup, which is a big reason why it seems so one-sided, and it really was one-sided. I do think that there is probably a couple more things that Tensor could have done, namely actually bringing different sets. It seems like after week 2, Tensor has kind of just resigned himself to bringing the same team every single week. While that can work if you have a team that is just far greater than everyone else, you will run out of steam once people start understanding how you're going to approach the game. And it seems like at this point in the season, Tensor has been figured out. So hopefully we see some improvements in week 5 and maybe some different sets. But as of right now, Tensor has been running the same sets for at least 3 weeks in a row. So make sure you keep an eye on that for the week 5 recap in case you are paying attention to which teams are in the playoff mix. Lastly, for the Dark Division, we had the LA Charge Beams falling to the Season 4 Sweepers in a sweep. The Sweepers actually had a really good game, I would say. Despite this matchup being on paper pretty one-sided, if Trick Room didn't get up, I think that the Charge Beams were going to have a really tough time. And in fact, they did. This is also alongside the fact that the Sweepers actually had a really good matchup, they were able to read the match really well. At least at the beginning of game 1, it was very clear that the Sweepers were comfortable and confident enough to make those hard reads, and they absolutely delivered on those hard reads. And I would say that 616 has got a lot of steam going into the back half of the season. Being undefeated at this point in the season, despite playing a lot of easier matchups, you also have beaten a cross-divisional rival whose only loss did come to you. So 616, I'm fairly confident, is kind of a lock for playoffs at this point. I would be very surprised if the Season 4 Sweepers didn't make it to the playoffs at this point. They have such a lead on everybody else that even if they're not the number 1 seed, they're definitely a favorite to make playoffs. And I think that they absolutely deserve it with how they've been playing so far. Moving over on into the Light Division, this is where games get a little more interesting as there are no more sweeps. We had the Booming Swampers taking on the Sunset Rose Meowsticks, and the Meowsticks did take it in 3. There was a little bit of drama in this game, I would say, with how the Booming Swamperts were actually able to come back into the set. I thought that this was probably going to be pretty one-sided for the Meowsticks, despite, in my opinion, the Booming Swamperts having individually stronger pieces. I thought the Meowsticks had a more free-flowing team that had a little bit more synergy. But it seems like those individual star power Pokemon were able to put a dent in the Meowsticks, who did eventually right the ship and were able to win this game in 3. Very tight set there. Honestly, one of the best games of the season, and definitely should be out there as a recommendation for the best game of the season so far. Next up, we had the Infernal Infernape versus the Calgary Flareons. This was a 3-game set that was a little less interesting. After speaking with the coaches after the game, it kind of seems like actually the Infernapes may have intentionally let this go to 3 games in order to make sure that Primarina got extra KOs. Obviously, intentionally losing is not really something that we condone here. And although I wouldn't say that it was actually an intentional loss where they did throw on purpose, I would say that there was a little bit more that the Infernapes could have done to actually get this in a 2-0 victory. That being said, I do think that this kind of keeps us in an interesting spot. We now have 4 teams that are all tied at the same record, and given how close these teams are in differential, I would hope that the Infernapes are more interested in pushing their differential higher rather than focus on getting KOs for specific Pokemon. Of course, I do think that this means that there's going to be a very tight race for the playoff spots. And although all you have to do is not be the lowest ranked team in that 4-team race, going to 3 on purpose does not necessarily fill me with confidence that you are able to push for that number 3 or even 2 spot. And number 1 might be out of reach if you don't end up beating all of your rivals that are in very close competition with you. That being said, it was a monster performance from Primarina, and we will get to that in the stats. As for the Flareons, this is another tough loss. I thought that they played relatively decently. I would have changed a couple of sets and definitely played a little bit differently, especially in Game 3. But still, a lot to like from the Flareons, and I think that a lot of the additions that they made to their team in the trades were excellent and definitely give us a lot of hope for what is to come. I think that the playoffs are probably out of reach for the Flareons at this point, but like I said, I am excited to see if they have any more left in the tank. The final game of the week was the Cretaceous Draco Meteors versus the New York Poke Rangers. This was yet another excellent instant classic 3-game set that the Poke Rangers did eventually win. Like I said in my actual predictions, I thought that this was going to be a Draco Meteors win, but Ada manages to pull it out. A lot of this came down to just the raw power of Fluttermane and Ogerpon, and as we've been saying all season, that's kind of the MO of the Poke Rangers. So I think that it is very impressive that they were actually managed to get this win, as I thought it was going to be a tough matchup for both of those Pokemon. Now I do think that Dale could have played a little bit differently and maybe had a couple of different sets that would have benefited him in this series, but it was still a very tight series that, in my opinion, could completely change outcome on the day, and that's the nature of competitive Pokemon. When teams are this close when it comes to both power level and coaches' experience level, I think that these are the types of matchups that you have to keep a close eye on, because these are going to become playoff games very quickly, and these micro differences in the outcomes is really what's going to determine the champion at the end of the day. So excellent points to Ada getting that win in week number 4 and staying in the driver's seat for the playoffs. And with that, of course, if you know the predictions that I had last week, you'll know that we finally broke our 4-2 curse that we've had up to this point. We got 5 predictions out of 6 correct this week. And the only one that we got wrong was choosing Dale in that very, very tight 3-game set versus Ada, which means that we moved to 17-7 on predictions this season. So excellent, excellent spot for us. We have more predictions for week 5, and I'll go ahead and talk them out going forward. For the first match in week number 5, the Season 4 Sweepers versus the 10-star team. I'm going to go ahead and take the Sweepers. They are currently undefeated, and I think that that's going to continue. I think their matchup's actually pretty solid. Definitely a couple of Pokemon that I think are going to be absolutely incredible in this match. And I think one of them is definitely going to be Archaludon. Archaludon, I thought, has gotten not as much usage that you want out of a 19-point Pokemon, but it is still incredibly valuable, and I think it's even more valuable in this matchup, especially because if I'm predicting correctly and Tensor doesn't change sets, you have a very predictable opponent to be going against, and that's kind of where Archaludon thrives. If you know exactly what you're going up against, you can tailor your Archaludon for the matchup, and I think that it's going to be a great Pokemon in this set. So we'll see how Tensor responds, how Tensor actually chooses to approach this game, and if Tensor actually chooses to switch up the sets. If that doesn't happen, I think that this is the Season 4 Sweepers game to lose. Next up, we have the LA Charge Beams versus the Dream Park Duo Blades. I'm going to take the Charge Beams here. This is, of course, a game for 5th place in my opinion. I think that it is a 4-team race for the 3 playoff spots we have left in the Dark Division. And I don't think that either of these teams are actually going to be in the discussion. The only team that actually is actually the Charge Beams. And I think that unless the Dual Blades actually reach out and get a little bit more help and support for how to learn and gain more experience in VGC, I think that this is going to be yet another really one-sided game. I hope that the Dual Blades actually do reach out, because I do think that they have an interesting core of Pokemon, and I hope that they perform a little bit better going in the season and don't end the season being very disappointed with how they played. Like I said, I'm here to help everybody, so if you're watching this video, Universality, I'm here to help, and I would love to work with you on how we can help you gain some experience in VGC. But yeah, that being said, we're at that last matchup for the Dark Division is, of course, our game, your Manchester Beavers versus the Bit Breakers. And this is a tough one, because I think that this game could potentially determine at least the second playoff spot in the Dark Division. Of course, like I said, I think that the Sweepers have got their spot on lock, but this matchup actually does determine who gets that number 2 seed. And of course, you know we are going to be backing ourselves. Manchester Beavers are hopefully going to get that playoff spot. But I think that this is very much a crucial game for both the Beavers and the Bit Breakers. Could be make or break. Of course, the 10-star team is right on our heels. So whoever gets this win gets an advantage for taking that playoff spot. And whoever loses this has definitely got to play catch up for the final 2 games of the season. I think that our matchup is actually pretty interesting. As per usual, of course, some of our strongest Pokemon have really good matchups, but I think it's also the case that some of our not so great Pokemon might have a nice niche in this game. So good luck to Calm Mind, as of course I think this might be a season-defining game for both teams. But of course, you know you got to back your Manchester Beavers, so hopefully we can get it done. Moving on into the Light Division, we have the Cretaceous Draco Meteors versus the Infernal Infernapes. This could be an interesting one. I think that, of course, there is a lot playing in both directions for these teams. Primarina has had a monster season to this point, although definitely you can argue that there was some Mickey games heading up to this point where I think that Primarina has farmed a few more KOs than it should have been able to get. With that being said, it has been the most impactful Pokemon in my opinion for the season so far. I don't necessarily think that this is a great Primarina game, though. That doesn't mean that it is necessarily a bad matchup for the Infernames, but I think that the quality of Pokemon on the Draco Meteors does mean that some of the gimmicks that the Infernames have relied on up to this point just aren't going to work. And on top of that, the Draco Meteors have, in my opinion, just the pound for pound Pokemon difference that really overwhelms the Infernames, where I think that they're trying to get a lot of value out of some of the less important Pokemon on their team. The Draco Meteors are all about having that star power and just saying, my Pokemon are better than yours, which is why I'm going to back them to win. Of course, this is yet another one of those games where I could see it going either way. But I do think that with the experience that we know that Dale has and how powerful we know this team is, I think that they can definitely pull out a victory here. And this, like I said, is one of those defining games for the playoff spots. There's four team race for 3 playoff spots, and these are 2 of the heavy hitters in that race. So hopefully we can see that separation coming out. Next up, we have the Booming Swamperts versus the Calgary Flareons, and similar to the second matchup in the Dark Division, this is a race for 5th place in this game. Unfortunately, I think neither of these teams really have a chance to make playoffs. All 4 of the other teams in the playoff race have got a pretty significant lead on both of them, and I think that they're going to continue winning. Of course, if either team is going to make the playoffs, it starts here. And although I do think that the Booming Swamperts have a better chance than the Flareons to actually make it, I don't think that it's a good enough chance. And as well, I'm actually going to take the Flareons in this matchup. I don't necessarily think that this is a advantageous matchup in either direction, but it's not necessarily 50-50 either. I do think that the individual quality of Pokemon goes to the Flareons here, and I certainly hope that Celadon is able to make use of the most impactful pieces on their team. But I do think that Celadon can get his first win in this week. Of course, this is not the end of the road if Celadon can't get the win here, but it is certainly a spot where I think he has the best chance to actually get his first win this season. As for Pokemon Queen, like I said, I could see this going the other direction, and I do think that Pokemon Queen has proven that despite the lower quality team, they're able to make up for it in quite a lot of close games, as well as some really good play versus coaches that probably should have them outmatched. So, like I said, I wouldn't be surprised if this goes the other way, but I am going to back Celadon for week number 5. And then finally, we have yet another heavyweight bout with the New York Poke Rangers versus the Sunset Rose Meowsticks. I think both of these teams have had unbelievable seasons to this point. I think that you could definitely back either of them in this match. I'm going to go ahead and believe in Ada this week, though. I think that the Poke Rangers have got a pretty decent matchup. I did call this out with the 10-star team versus Meowsticks game, but there is a problematic ghost type on the Poke Rangers, and it happens to be the best Pokemon in the entire league with Fluttermane. And I think that along with a pretty well-designed team for the Poke Rangers, does mean that Parastrap is going to have some issues this week. And on top of that, I do think that the way that the Meowsticks can actually change up the game doesn't necessarily have a good way of doing so this week. Mainly that I think that both Dragonite and Zoroark are going to struggle with both Hearthflame and Fluttermane, as well as Staraptor. All of those Pokemon definitely give those Pokemon a very hard time. And yeah, I'm going to go ahead and also back the experience of Ada. I do see this probably going to 3 games, as I think that Rose can definitely put out some strategies that are detrimental to Ada, but hopefully we get another really great game out of this. So that is what I got for the predictions. Let's go ahead and check out the playoff standings so far. Of course, like I said, both divisions are pretty much a 4-team race for 3 playoff spots. The Charge Beams are not that far behind, but differential-wise, they are struggling quite a bit. So it would take a miracle for them to be able to come back into that race. As of right now, I do believe that your top 3 teams are probably the 3 best teams in each division. But with such a tight race in all 4 of those teams in both divisions, anything could happen, and we could see huge mix-ups going into this. If I, gun to my head, had to make a choice right now, what are the 3 playoff teams from both divisions? I think it's probably the 3 teams that currently hold the playoff spots. Although, like I said, I could see the actual placing of these teams shift around a little bit. So hopefully we will see that coming to fruition here soon. Finally, let's go ahead and check out our stats. As I said previously, Primarina had a monster week 4, grabbing 10 additional KOs to move 8 KOs ahead of Golden Go, who unfortunately did not grab a single KO in week 4. And that is quite a big difference. Of course, a big Pokemon to note here is Basculegion F. A great value also for 13 points, has 8 wins, coming to the same number of games as Primarina, but having a much better win ratio and surviving more games than Primarina as well. I think that is pretty much a great allegory for where each team is at. You have a ton of Pokemon that I think do represent how every team is kind of doing. You of course have the 10-star team, which in my opinion is pretty heavily carried by Golden Go and its own power, as well as the Infernames, who seem to be feeding Primarina and kind of forgetting about the rest of their team. Then, of course, the Sweepers, who I believe have a pretty well-rounded team between Basculegion F and Iron Hands, just outside of the top 10, that do kind of show the strength that that team has. And then Dragonite and Politoed kind of showing that the Meowstics have had to kind of rely on things outside of the Perish Trap in order to get their victories. Of course, Hearthflame and Fluttermane do show that they are the best Pokemon on the New York Poke Rangers. Staraptor not that far behind, giving them a great case. And then surprising to me at least is Entei as the best Pokemon on the Cretaceous Draco Meteors. Of course, Chenpao not that far behind, does kind of show that that dynamic duo is doing great, as well as Ogerpon Wellspring. Excellent partner for Chenpao. Works beautifully with Entei as well. You'll be shocked to know that Raging Bolt actually is hanging down at 27 with only 4 KOs to its name. I think most of us probably could have predicted that Raging Bolt ends with more KOs by the end of the season, and I do think it probably will, as I think it has some pretty good matchups coming up, but we'll have to see. And then, of course, we also need to talk about your Manchester Beavers, who hold quite a few spots in the top 25. If you go down to top 30, we have 5 Pokemon in the top 30. Although we don't have any Pokemon in the top 5, we do have 2 Pokemon in the top 10, which kind of shows that your Bewares are pretty well rounded, and we have a lot of versatile options. So hopefully we can continue to make use of that and show why we are deserving of a playoff spot. Yeah, with all of that being said, that is all I have for you. And hopefully you enjoyed. Hopefully you continue to cheer on your Manchester Beavers for the rest of season number 4. And I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.